So this talk is an attempt to juxtapose our gospel tradition with this consciousness that the Occupy movement is trying to get us to focus on, which is the fundamental task facing us, which is to address the widening disparity between the haves and the have-nots. And my job is to try to give a little bit of theological and biblical underpinning to the work that Vardens-fest is trying to promote in many different workshops. Now, obviously the problem is that our churches do not often address the difficult questions of life and society which include the social issues, and that's one of the reasons why people have been leaving our churches, because we do not have sufficient courage to speak sufficiently clearly and to act sufficiently clearly. And rather than being defensive and pointing to what we are doing, I think we always need to have eyes to see what we are not doing and what we are not saying. So that's a sort of a crisis of faith. And one of the reasons that we have this crisis in our churches is that the Jesus story that we tell doesn't take place in the real world. It's as if the Bible stories took place in Disneyland, some other place far away, apart from the real world of of conflict and injustice. It's as if Jesus is floating above the world and light is shining out. And much of this symbolism is right in our churches. Here, there are many problems of the Jesus of Disneyland, but the major problem I want to look at today is that the Jesus of Disneyland has no history and no geography. And because he has no history or geography, he has no real humanity. And so that's not much use to human beings who are struggling in the real world for humanization. And because Jesus has no place, then this Jesus is neutral on all the social issues, doesn't really have an opinion. And that, of course, we know is widespread in our churches. The problem, of course, is that the God of the Bible did take sides in social struggles, and Jesus of Nazareth, as a disciple of that God, also took sides. So, I believe one of our tasks as Christians concerned for justice is to be radical Christians. And by that I mean, at least in English, the word radical comes from the Latin radix, and I think it's also radical in Svensk. So these come from the Latin term radix, which means root, and the way in which we can reconnect with the Jesus of actual place and time and humanity is to go back to the roots of our faith, and there's no better place to rediscover the roots of our faith than our scriptures. And in fact, our scriptures were forged amidst the context of empire. From the time Abraham was called out of Mesopotamia, the Bible has been the story of God's people struggling to survive and remain faithful in successive contexts of empire. Whether we consider the story of Moses leading people out of Egyptian slavery, or the prophets speaking truth to Babylonian or Persian empires, or Jesus and the early church contesting the omnipotent claims of Rome, the story has always been the same. The biblical story, at its root, is the story of how we follow the way, the Torah, of justice and mercy in a world defined by empire. From the perspective of the Bible, if you've seen one empire, you've seen them all. Egypt, Babylon, Rome, they're all similar, which is why they are all called the beast in the New Testament. And the same must be said about more modern empires, whether that's imperial Christendom or the British Empire or, of course, the American one. All of this stands in tension with the biblical God who stands with the victims of empire and refuses to be domesticated by empire. Now, rather than use empire as some sort of rhetorical flourish, let me just give a simple, but I think precise definition of what I mean. Empire can be defined as the rule of the center over the periphery. That's an architecture of our world, and it determines almost everything. It determines who has food and who doesn't. It determines who has homes or sovereignty. And ultimately, it determines who flourishes and who suffers, who lives and who dies. To say it in another way, simply, the essence of imperialism lies in the metropolitan domination, the domination of large, concentrated, powerful societies, dominating particularly the economies of smaller and weaker nations so that wealth flows upward. And that's the kind of power, in particular, my country has been exercising now for well more than half a century. And in Scandinavia, you are sort of part of that architecture. And so it's just important that we name that at the outset as we approach Scripture, so that we're not reading Scripture in Disneyland. Scripture did not take place in Disneyland, and we are not living in Disneyland as we read it, although it seems like that in our churches sometimes. So our task today is to un-Disneyfy the gospel. And I want to take just one little example from one of the earliest testimonies of the Jesus movement that we find in our New Testament, and that is the Gospel of Mark. Some of you who know my work will not be surprised that I want to draw on Mark's Gospel, and I know that Karin will be particularly happy that we're working with Mark. And what I want to do is just look at some of the opening lines of the Gospel, because the opening of any story sets context. And what I want to do is offer a model for how to read the Bible economically in order that the church might read the economy biblically today, if that makes any sense. Here's what one recent scholar of the New Testament, a venerable veteran scholar, John Dominic Crossan, said in a recent book. It was precisely and specifically by the shores of the Sea of Galilee that the radicality, there's that word again, of God, Israel's God, confronted the normalcy of Rome's civilization. Under Herod Antipas, in the second century, in the second decade of the first century of the Common Era. That's a way of setting context. Real world, not Disneyland. And I like that way of putting it, and I want to investigate that a little bit. In order to see that in this particular moment, the Palestinian Jew Jesus of Nazareth made choices. And those choices were specifically to stand with that sector of his world that was being most disenfranchised by the economy of the Roman Empire. So let's investigate it a little bit. Our first stop on the un-Disney tour bus is the village of Sepphoris. Now, many of you will not know of the village of Sepphoris because we never talk about Sepphoris in church, but we do talk about Nazareth. Everybody knows that Nazareth was where Jesus grew up. And I want you to see on this map that Nazareth is very close to Sepphoris. But you'll see that Sepphoris is a big dot, and Nazareth is a little tiny dot. Why? Because, Nazareth we only know Nazareth existed because it's mentioned in the New Testament. Otherwise, there's no testimony to Nazareth in the other literature of antiquity. It was an obscure village. It was like where I was an exchange student in Norway. Mjøndalen. How many of you have heard of Mjøndalen? Yeah, 3 people, exactly. Just a small little village. But everybody in the ancient world knew about Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was only 4 kilometers from Nazareth. Why did everybody know about Sepphoris? Well, because Sepphoris was a large Roman fortress city, out of which the client ruler of Galilee, a man by the name of Herod Antipas, he was the son of Herod the Great. It's how he projected power into the hinterland of Galilee. So Sepphoris it had Roman colosseums, and it had military bases. And we know particularly about Sepphoris because Herod the Great, who was the big daddy king, died in the year 4 before the Common Era. Giving you a little bit of a history lesson here. Some of you know this, but most of the people in our churches don't. He died in the year 4. As soon as he died, there were insurrections all over the country because everyone hated Herod. He was a tyrant. So there were these armed skirmishes all over the country as Judean nationalists were trying to get back their sovereignty from the Herodians who were in alliance with the Roman Empire. Are you following me so far? One of the most significant insurrections that happened in that period happened at Sepphoris, where Jewish guerrillas broke into the armory at Sepphoris and took all the weapons and began an armed uprising. It's written about in histories, and you hear echoes of it in the New Testament. In response to this insurrection, so imagine rather that we are in Nicaragua in 1979, and the Sandinistas overthrow the Somocistas, and for a few years there's a little bit of liberation, and then the empire strikes back through the Contras. Some of you know this history of Central America. That's what was happening in Sepphoris. So the empire struck back, and it razed the city of Sepphoris to the ground. Just completely razed it, took everyone off into slavery. It didn't care whether you were loyal to the revolt or loyal to the empire. Everybody got whacked. This happened when Jesus was just a little kid. 4 kilometers from his front doorstep. He would have seen the smoke rising from Sepphoris, right out his window. This is a picture of the ruins. You can go today to the ruins of Sepphoris. It's one of the major archaeological sites in Israel today. We're standing in the ruins, and the hills in the background, that's Nazareth. So I'm literally mean he would have been watching this happen. But not only that, not only would he have seen Sepphoris burning, but what kind of worker was Jesus' daddy? Yeah, he was a tekton in Greek, which means he was also a construction worker.